I would like to introduce myself very briefly, then move a bit into the big area of issues which we are going to discuss afterwards and focusing on. I will present the panelists, of course, distinguished speakers this morning. Then we will have a first round of short introductory remarks and discussion here between the panelists, moving into the auditorium afterwards. So my name is Dirk Messner. I'm the director of the German Development Institute. So welcome to Bonn. We are located here with our institute, as most of you might know, in Bonn. And I'm very happy that the EADI conference again is taking place in Bonn. And I'm very happy to see many good friends and colleagues which we have been working together with during the last years and decades. So welcome to this plenary session. The issues we would like to focus on: inequality. I think that we should try to take the picture right here, having our introductory remarks. And there are several trends moving into different directions, and we need to take these directions in mind. There are certain very positive trends, actually, when it comes to socioeconomic development. Growth in many developing countries is high, even under the conditions of international financial turbulences, even in least developed countries. In many African countries, 5%, 6%, 7% growth. So growth is there in many countries. And as we all know, poverty is declining around the world. This is a very, very good signal. And most of the very poor people are now living in middle-income countries. This implies that reducing poverty even further in middle-income countries might be easier than reducing poverty in fragile states. So also a positive trend. But then there is, and the last important element, beyond growth and beyond the fact that poverty is declining, is the whole debate about new global middle classes. So at the end of 50 years of development after Second World War, important middle class structures are growing in many countries. Important trend also, moving into an interesting direction of new wealth creation dynamics. On the other hand side, we do have very important challenges regarding socioeconomic development in parallel to these positive trends. Inequality seems to be an issue in many, many countries. In developing countries, emerging economies, and OECD countries at the same time. It seems to be a global phenomenon. The question which might be discussed here is, are there global drivers behind, or are drivers behind equality country-specific? And then, of course, what can we do about it? If these are global trends, what needs to be done on local, national, and global levels? If this is very country-specific, what does this imply for strategies on national levels and regarding international cooperation and international development cooperation? So the phenomenon of inequality needs to be discussed. And as you will see, there are different types of inequalities which we are interested in. On the one hand side, it is about Gini coefficients, it is about socioeconomic inequality trends and dynamics. On the other hand side, we do have also phenomenons of political exclusive governance patterns translating into inequalities. So the drivers here are not economic developments as such. The drivers here might be institutional settings and governance patterns. And we will listen to colleagues here at the panel focusing on sustainability issues also, because inequality is not only a question which is related to growth and growth patterns and socioeconomic development. It has to do with sustainability challenges at the same time. The whole debate about planetary boundaries is relevant here. What's about the right to development when planetary boundaries are nearer and nearer and nearer? So new types of inequalities which we have to have in mind. This is a spectrum which we are going to focus on, and this is a broad agenda for this morning, and we will try to have an interesting debate on that, bringing these different perspectives in. So let's move to our distinguished speakers before we go directly into the content and into our introductory remarks. I will start on the right-hand side. Sorry, I have to organize myself here. Luca, Yeah, I need the list of all your... Yeah, fine, thank you. Okay. So I would like to start on my right-hand side with Branko Milanovic. And Branko Milanovic is currently at the City University of New York, engaged, doing research on inequality, global middle classes. You have been working a lot about historical trends in this field. You have been working with the World Bank, at the World Bank, on these kind of issues, inequality and growth dynamics. So, Branko, I'm very happy to have you here, and you will give us the big picture in terms of trends. Not going into the debate, what can we do about it? This is what we are going to discuss afterwards. Branko will focus on what are we talking about when it comes to inequality trends in the global economy. I will first start to introduce all of us. Yeah. On my right-hand side, I have Luca Cazzeli. We are old and good friends, Luca. And Luca, you are now working at the University of Athens. You have been working in the administration and in ministries as a minister also of the government of Greece. You have been the Minister of Economy in Greece and Minister of Labor. So you are coming from the academic field and having also political experience in a country in which obviously inequality challenges and how to manage the tensions between structural reforms and inequality issues. This is a huge debate in your country. It's a huge debate in Europe. No? And it's important to have this debate here in an EADI conference, and we see that we are talking about trends which are not only relevant for developing countries and emerging economies. This is a European concern also, and Luca, you will talk about this and about political implications. Peter Knoringa, also an old friend. Peter, you are working at the Institute for Social Studies for a longer period already, and you are focusing on, in your recent research, on global middle classes and their role in societies, and their role in societies in OECD countries and developing economies and emerging economies alike. And you are linking this kind of debate with sustainability challenges also. So the role of middle classes when it comes to sustainable development. And you are asking the question, are these emerging middle classes important actors to drive new kinds of social norms? So is this not only an economic phenomenon, a result of a growth process? Are the middle classes drivers of new types of development? In our title, we do have the term responsible development. So are middle classes drivers of responsible development? No? So Peter, great, that question mark. You have to answer the question. Okay. I'm in a very comfortable situation. I will ask questions this morning. You have to answer. No? So Peter, great to have you here this morning. On the left-hand side, then, Jojita Gupta, Professor for Environment and Development at the Global South, in the Global South at the University of Amsterdam, right? Yes. And you are coming from India, no? And originally. And you have been doing a lot of research on sustainability issues. You will bring in inequality challenges which result from sustainability challenges. You use the term of the Anthropocene. I saw this in your statement where you describe what you are going to talk about. I'm happy that you mentioned that. I'm personally working a lot about environmental challenges and the concept of the Anthropocene, which is arguing that nowadays, we as human beings are the driver of the Earth system as such, and we are moving towards planetary boundaries. So what's then about the right to development? No? This is an equality and inequality challenge, obviously, which goes far beyond socioeconomic growth patterns. No? So, Jojita, you will have in mind this kind of questions. Pierre Jacquet, on my left-hand side, President of the Global Development Network and Professor of International Economics. Pierre, you are working on global economic issues, on global financial markets. We have been talking very often about the international turbulences in financial markets and impacts on the developing world. So you will, at the end of our debate here, bring in the question, responsible development. What is that about? No? Is this different from inclusive development? And when we talk about responsible development, having in mind all these interest constellations in the global economy resulting from inequalities, Is there one concept of responsible development, and what can we do about it when we talk about international cooperation? So this is the kind of questions which you are going to address. So these are our panelists. I think it's a very interesting round of people here on the panel, and we will start with Branko now. Okay. Branko, please come in and give us the big picture about inequality trends.
Thank you very much, Dirk. I would like to thank you for inviting me. And excuse me, it is a pleasure to be here. If we can actually get now on my PowerPoint, it would be even greater pleasure. Okay, first, actually, of course, as you know, I have 7 minutes, so I would be very brief. I would like to point out, to start actually with 2 graphs, and first, all these things that I'm showing now, you can ignore them. The only thing that is relevant for these 7 minutes are these green dots. Now, what are the green dots? The green dots are represent the level of global inequality, which is inequality between world citizens. It's a long story how it is calculated, but it's basically you take household surveys from 120 countries or plus, you actually apply PPP exchange rates, and then you convert all of that and you get the Gini coefficient for the world as a whole. That has never been done before 1980s because the data didn't exist. So it's actually something brand new. I mean, relatively brand new. The striking thing there is to notice, to observe, and actually the latest number for 2011, which I don't still have here, would be even lower than this. In other words, we have really 2 contradictory developments going on currently in the world. You have essentially, as we all know, rising inequalities at the level of nation states, with practically all the countries over the last 30 years, with some exceptions in Latin America. But everywhere else, you had either significantly increasing inequalities like in China, US, or Russia, UK, or like slightly increasing inequalities like in Sweden, Netherlands, Germany, or elsewhere. So that's basically the story. However, at the global level, we have the opposite story in the last 10 to 15 years, driven by remarkable growth rate of China and more recently of India. So that actually inequality between citizens in the world has now been, for the last 10 or 15 years, on the decline. That's a very important point to realize that we are really talking about, 2 developments which are going together, but when we all the time speak about rising inequality, we should remember that at the global level, that's not the case. We'll discuss it much more in detail later, but I'm just going to bring this up. However, what is also important there to realize, and this is based on the 20-year panel data for 20 years, and this graph shows you a very important thing, which is, I think, extremely relevant for the rest of the discussion. On the horizontal axis, you have people of the world lined up from the poorest 1%, so that would be the number on the very left, to the richest 1%, which would be number 100, because they're the 100th percentile. Many people in the room are part of that global top 1%. I would actually say a very large percentage of this group. And then over the last 20 years, on the vertical axis, you have the real rate of growth at different percentiles of the global income distribution. And I will not go into all the details. I want to simply point out to 2 key developments. And this is this one. Here, that actually around the median of the global income distribution, which is relatively low in actual income. This is about people about $4 or $5 PPP per day. We have had a large increase in real income. That's basically what I call the China's middle class. So these are the people who have been really major beneficiaries, if you will, of globalization. We have really dramatic increases also not only in China, but in Indonesia, Thailand, India, and so forth, but mostly in large Asian countries. The second important point to realize is that people who are relatively rich by the global standards, which means people around the 80th or 90th percentile globally, but who are relatively poor from the perspective of the countries where they live, which are generally rich countries, they have not had a very good time. So you actually see the second point, which I call US lower middle class actually had no growth over the last 25 years, or very little growth. Actually, in the US it was about 25%, in Germany it was about 7%, in Japan it was 0%. So you take three large countries of the rich world, and then really the lower middle class had no growth. So I'm not going to belabor this point, but it's something that I think will come up in the discussion later. When we talk about the rising global middle class, we have something which are really two classes. One which is relatively rich, Western middle class, and another one which is an emerging Asian, let's call it like that, middle class. And then the question that can be asked is whether the stagnation of the incomes in the rich worlds is somewhat related to the rise of the incomes in the emerging Asian countries. And as you can imagine, there are arguments in favor and arguments against. I will not talk about that today, but I just want to point out that this is quite a dramatic change. And then at the very top, of course, you have had a large increase in the top 1% globally. So essentially, you have this very unusual curve of gains, and that curve is actually very high at the median, almost no growth among the lower middle classes of the rich world, and very strong growth at the top 1%. So how does it translate? This is a current graph for 2011, more recently, how the current world looks like. And since this is a conference about, among other topics, about global middle class, I actually did something which I don't normally like to do, because I really think even the term of the global middle class is kind of a misnomer, because we use this, in this case, I use the levels of between $10 per day and $100 per day. Now, that lower level, by the rich country standards, is below the poverty line of the rich countries. So when people get excited about the global middle class, they forget that actually the numbers of what they call the global middle class are really poor people in the rich countries. And they don't feel that these are people who are actually living on social aid, that they are actually global, they are middle class. But in reality, that's what the lower bound of that number is, which is in this case $10, and the upper bound is $100. And my last two slides would be then to show you, if we accept these bounds, these thresholds, how the world looks as of today, and using PPP numbers, I have to make this caveat, from 2005. And then basically you have, as you can see, about 30% of the people who are below $2 per day. Then you have what I call, for the lack of a better term, the masses, people between the $2 and $10 per day. And then we have this global middle class, which is now about 30% or so. And then it so happens that people who are above $100 per day are about 1 to 2% of the global population, and that's actually of course, the rich. Now, these numbers change a little bit. Oh, I don't have it. I think let me see. Yes, they change a little bit if you use PPPs from the brand new 2011 exercise and keep the same threshold, because then you have really significant change in reduction of the number of people who are poor and an increase in the so-called masses. But as you can see, the global middle class is not very much affected, because here these numbers are driven essentially by the now currently much higher income levels of India. So people who were then among the poor globally now become the masses, according to them. And my final slide is that I want to show you, like, where do these global middle class people live? Do I have 1 minute?
Yes.
And one striking thing, actually, which we all know, but it's more striking when you see the numbers. The country which is the largest, actually, in the numbers of people who are the so-called global middle class is urban China. So you can see it's 500 million people. And then, of course, the next one is the US, and then Russia, Brazil, Germany, and so on. But it is a striking fact that when you start, because in Germany, for example, in the US, this global middle class is basically the bulk of the population, and then the top class of, 50 million Americans is the rich. Similarly, in Germany, 50 million would be global middle class, and maybe 60 million would be global middle class, and 20 or 30 million would be the rich. But it is striking to realize how much larger is then this Chinese global middle class compared to everybody else, and how small is Indian middle class. Now, the numbers for India may be somewhat of an underestimate, but even when you actually try to account for that, that number really does not come comes to equal to Mexico. So it's really big gap between China and India in that respect. And then the last point is that actually if you look at the composition of population, I think it's actually quite interesting, is that you can actually think that in the Chinese urban areas, you have no more poor, practically globally poor, that the largest class in both US and China is now the so-called global middle class, and that, of course, the Chinese global middle class, this is the blue color in the middle, is larger than by numbers, is larger than the American. But one important finding, and I'll finish with that, is to realize, when you look at these numbers, you realize not only how big is the Chinese middle class, but also how the urban areas in China are now taking features which are much more features, to some extent, of a developed country than of a developing country. It does not apply to the rural areas, and as we know, the gap between rural and urban areas in China is very large. But the picture of the urban China is now really moving to look at a picture of the much more developed country than we used to see. So that would be all. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Branko, for giving us these numbers and the big pictures within 7 minutes. This is really a challenge, and you met it. Peter, would you like to come in with your points?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank Branko for the sobering points about the numbers on global middle classes. And secondly, in preparing, we all got the message that we would do 7 minutes, but we also got the message that we were not allowed or not expected to do a PowerPoint presentation. And I was one of the obedient members of the panel who actually listened to that, which is one of the reasons why I don't have a PowerPoint this morning.
Which is perfect.
Which is perfect. Then I thought, well, if I'm not doing a PowerPoint, I should probably tackle a few examples instead of trying to build up an argument. So that's what I'm going to try and do. And these examples are results from ongoing research that I'm doing together with Khalid Nadvi from the University in Manchester on a research project on how states, firms, consumers, NGOs in China, India, and Brazil are moving from being standard takers to becoming standard makers. And so this is related to the question, to what extent do these new players, new between brackets by now, are starting to take the lead in pushing towards responsible development or not? I have 3 relatively short examples. So I guess 2 minutes each, right? And the underlying story here is that there is not one actor anymore that can be held responsible for pushing this agenda. It's not states, it's not firms, it's not NGOs, it's not consumers themselves. It's always particular kinds of combinations, or at least most of the time it is particular kinds of combinations. First example that I wanted to mention relates to something that was said yesterday in the panel on middle classes, that somebody said it's only second generation middle class people that have grown up in a situation of security, that have the kind of attitudes that can lead to valuing, for example, social standards, labor standards, environmental standards, and are willing to pay higher prices for products that they want to buy. And this reminded me very much of interviews that we are doing at the moment in Brazil, China, and India, where basically all the large firms are telling us that the present generation of what we call global middle classes in the global south are not interested in these standards, but they expect that their children will be. And because of that, they are preparing for that. Yeah? Now, the NGOs that we speak, especially in Brazil, to some extent also in India, are much more optimistic. They say, no, it's already around the corner. But this is a contested area. The only standards that are already very important in this group are food safety standards, for obvious reasons. Okay, second example. Second example is an example of a private sector initiative in which no NGOs or states are involved, but which is setting behind the scenes, very importantly, the agenda for what is responsible, what is the we here, And who do we think is responsible for what in the global economy? Because if you look at which companies are involved in this, this is like a who is who in the international brand economy. This is an initiative, the Global Social Compliance Program. It's not secret. They have a website. All their tools and stuff is there. But very few people in the development arena know about this initiative. Now, what do these companies do? And it is led by the largest retailers in the world, companies like Walmart, Carrefour, Tesco, and a couple of other smaller ones like Albert Heijn in the Netherlands. Plus all the big brands from Coca-Cola to Nike to everybody is there. And they talk about what they call harmonizing responsibility standards. That includes both environment and social standards. Now you can imagine that they want to do this and that there are certain benefits also. For example, for firms that are suppliers to these companies, it makes a big difference. Because it makes it so much easier and cheaper if you can use your Walmart certificate to supply to Carrefour. Yeah, so that is a big advantage. There is also a downside. That is, these technical people from these companies, these quality managers, are sitting around the table and are deciding which elements go into the standard and which things fall off the table. Now you can imagine which are the likely things to fall off the table. These are the more difficult to measure, more politically sensitive dimensions, like freedom of association, collective bargaining. What stays on the table are things that firms think that consumers care about: child labor, minimum wage, health and safety conditions. Yeah? So there is a strong tendency at the moment. The headquarters of this organization is in Paris. It's all very open, yeah? But very few people in development seem to pay attention to this. Some NGOs that I've interviewed on this say, well, we're not interested in them because they're not legitimate, because it's not a multi-stakeholder initiative. And my response to them has been, well, that might be true in your view, but they're calling the shots. This is the engine room that determines the standards for the next 10 to 15 years, perhaps. One other interesting thing of this organization is that now lead firms from the emerging economies are starting to knock on the door. If you go on the website, you can now see that 2, 3, 4, 5, every week another one. Big companies from China, from India, are starting to enter this elite group in the global brand economy. Okay, third and last example. Do I still have 2 minutes? Yeah, okay. The third and last example is about an initiative called Bon Sucre. This is about ethical, more responsible ways of dealing with sugar. This is an initiative that is a multi-stakeholder initiative. So it is politically more correct, so to speak. It is also very interesting because unlike earlier initiatives of this nature, in which global firms based in Europe, in the United States, were always in the lead, this is an initiative where Brazilian companies are in the lead. Not surprisingly, perhaps, because Brazil is one of the, or perhaps the largest producer of sugar in the world. Same like with orange juice, for example, but I now want to focus on sugar. When we were in Sao Paulo in March, April this year, interviewing the people responsible for sustainable supply chain management for the sugar industry in Brazil, we met a lady who said, yeah, this Bon Sucre is very important. Of course, we have positioned it in London so that consumers in Europe and the US think that this is a European initiative, so that gets more credibility. Moreover, what is very important for us, actually there is a guy from a Dutch NGO, Solidaridad, who has been the key broker getting us together. He was what in our research we would call the civic innovator, the person that actually brings these different groups together to make them do slightly more than what they would do on their own. And they are using also this NGO, or using between brackets, to sort of push ahead, and if they are ready, they follow, and if not, they backtrack. So what we see emerging here, and we see different examples of this in different places, is that lead firms from China, India, Brazil, but also NGOs, also to some extent state organizations, are starting to play a more important role in who is setting which standards for whom in the global economy. And this is part of the global middle class story, but it is a different, somewhat different take. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. You made clear that global middle class debate is not only about wealth creation, it is also about new patterns of global governance at the end of the day. Now, you are asking whether these new actors are playing an important role or might play an even more important role in the future in creating conditions for new kind of standards for the global economy. So thank you very much for that, Peter. Jorita, now it's yours.
Thank you. So my hypothesis today is that we live in the Anthropocene, and that may mean that inequality between people and between states will increase in the coming 30 years. Let me explain. The Anthropocene refers to the fact that humans are using, producing, and consuming resources to such an extent that it has never been done before. And this has led to the naming of a new geological age, the Anthropocene. Now, in this Anthropocene, what we are seeing is the great acceleration. So almost everything that we use, produce, and consume is going rapidly up in the last 10, 15 years. Now, in this Anthropocene, one of the issues that will affect all of us is what we would call shrinking ecospace. Now, shrinking ecospace or environmental utilization space has three components to it. The first is that some of our abiotic resources are shrinking in the short term, or in the medium term, or in the long term. Now, this, for example, refers to phosphorus, and phosphorus we need for food production, and everybody needs food worldwide. So we probably have to have rules about how to share this phosphorus. Another example is rare earths that we use for telephones, and telephones are absolutely essential for everybody in the middle class, but it's also essential for the poor. It helps them participate in the informal economy, which means that we might also have to regulate how we share rare earths. The next point is we have limited land, and to some extent, more or less, limited fresh water. But the number of users and users are increasing. You need land for urbanization, but you need land for biofuel. You need land for food production. So this competition is going to mean, on a per capita basis, less food, less water. The third element is limited sinks. So if you want to maintain your ecosystem and the services you get from it, so ecosystem gives us four types of services. It gives us food, water, so that's the productive services. It gives us a stable climate, that's the regulatory services. It supports us, it cycles nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus through the system. And it gives us spiritual support, recreational support, religious support. So these services, if you want to maintain, you have to use the ecosystem carefully. And I'm going to explain this through climate change. So let us assume you want a stable climate because everyone enjoys the climate. Then you need to address the climate change problem. If you want to address the climate change problem, we will probably have to leave 80% of the fossil fuels underground. And that means the question is, who is allowed to take out these fossil fuels and who is not? So this is the question of who is allowed to develop and who is not if we want to address the climate change problem. So this is very contentious because since the 1940s, since the end of World War II, the developing countries have been arguing for the right to develop at the global arena for a number of other reasons. They felt that the international economic order was not allowing them to develop. And now the question will be, will the environmental order be used to not let them develop? And what you're also finding is that when you have climate change, you will have impacts, and probably the impacts will hurt the poorest more. In which case, again, you will get increasing inequality between people and states. I also mentioned earlier that we will get more inequality between states, and that refers to the fact that when you have limited resources, states don't want to share. So if you have limited water, you don't want to share it with other countries, even if it's a transboundary resource. And if you have resources like rare earths, well, China has stopped exporting it in 2010. So countries will try to control themselves and rebuild the notion of sovereignty, and that might lead to greater inequalities in the future. So how do you deal with scarcity? Well, there are 4 ways. The first way is the market. You price the goods, then only the rich will be empowered. The second way is hegemony. Here you allow powerful countries to gain access to those resources. So this empowers the powerful. Then you can do polycentricity. You allow everyone to do their own thing. That's fine, but it won't regulate the sharing issue between countries and between peoples. So my argument for responsible government means that we need responsible multi-level governance and global governance. So we need a global social contract that's much more responsible. And the key argument of the social contract at the global level is that we need global rule of law, which is both procedural and substantive, which in German is, I think, the Rechtsstaat, and we need a global constitution. And the argument behind this is that no state in the world should be above the law. The United States can't just say, I'm not going to participate in the Kyoto Protocol because it doesn't suit my interests. But alternatively, we will also need a lot of money for redistribution. And what we find today is that according to some statistics, about 50% of banking, 50% of trade, and about 33% of foreign direct investment bypasses taxes. They channel their resources through the offshore tax havens. This is called the new phenomena of offshoring. And actually, I think that one of the reasons, one of the ways to access this money, which causes great deal of concentration of wealth at the top, is through global constitutionalism and rule of law. So no bank should be above the law. And of course, this is ideal. But in most of the Western countries, we found that there has been a process of rule of law and constitutionalism. And so it is theoretically possible at the global level. But what you really need is a global social movement on inclusive development and constitutionalism to protect the values that we perhaps see as important. And I think that some of these values are already available in many developed and developing country contexts, but also globally. For example, we do have a human rights contract at the global level, but also nationally. In 2010, we also got the human right to water and sanitation. We do have principles on environment and development which talk about how to allocate responsibilities between states and peoples, but not yet between the middle classes. And that is a role for us to do, develop further. And we do have agreements regarding, for example, ecosystemic standards. So in the Biodiversity Convention, we are talking about certain standards to try and deal with our ecosystems. And in the Climate Change Convention, we're talking about the 2 degrees target. So essentially, we have the ingredients. It's just spread throughout the system. And basically, what we do need, perhaps from an environmental perspective, is to try and ensure that our development takes place within these needs. Peter worried me a little bit when he said we have to wait for the second generations in the developing countries. I think the second generations in the developing countries, for example, Delhi, will have enormous problems because there will be no water in the future. If you look at China, China's energy plans for the next 30, 40 years is not supported by the water that they have. And water is a key ingredient for fossil fuel production and nuclear production. So in many ways, the development plans in many of these developing countries is taking a very sectoral perspective and not looking at the other constraints. So I would argue that perhaps, and in your case you said second generation might start thinking about human rights, perhaps as a third generation that thinks about environment. Maybe we don't have the time for that. And so for that reason, we probably need carrots and sticks at all levels of governance to try and create a world within development is protected for future generations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Georgita, for giving us this sustainability perspective, because you showed and argued that the way how people are becoming rich or even stagnating at a very high level of income is very important because the planetary boundaries are existent. No? And you gave us a bit a different perspective compared to what Peter argued about. Peter presented a bottom-up process of stabilizing social and environmental standards, observing what's happening. No? This is empiric. And you are arguing it from a normative perspective, saying that we have very little time, bringing in a different kind of empirical data because the sustainability and planetary empirical data are also hard data. No? So different kind of normative perspectives and empirical perspectives here. Pierre, now it's your turn. Responsible development. What is that for, about, and what are we doing to push responsible development? Do you have a microphone there? Yeah. Or take only the microphone. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, one of the questions underlying this forum is whether the emergence of a middle class in many developing countries will lead to more, quote-unquote, responsible development. And it seems that most of the debates so far should make us wary of any deterministic answer to that. We could note that the vibrant middle class in our rich countries has not prevented poverty actually to increase recently and inequality to increase. And Professor Chie Chen yesterday mentioned that the Chinese middle class might not be actually pushing for democracy. So it seems that the answers will be probably it depends and will be contextualized and localized. But what is nice, I think, about this symposium is that we have at least partly moved from the tendency of this colloquia generally to be in the advocacy realm. We should be responsible, to something which is a bit more a political economy approach to responsible development, that is to try to think how this desired outcome might take place and what should be the role of what could be the role of the middle class in that. However, we still are a bit in the sort of advocacy realm, which is fine because advocacy may influence positively behaviors. But when, for example, Joyeta, you say, can we wait? I mean, who is we? We in this room? Don't know. Maybe we can't wait. But whether we can or we can't is probably irrelevant to the fact of whether action will take place, where it should take place. So I think what we need in this room is a sort of combination of the empirical approach in which one tries to understand how things are taken into account, how perceptions of urgencies are shaped, and the kind of broad recommendation that we, honest with ourselves, could make. So what I mean to say is that in this symposium we are oscillating between normative and positive approaches, and I think we should at all time be clear about where we are exactly. So my comments will actually be on these lines. Let me start with normative aspects. And there I'm a bit puzzled because I don't know what responsible development is. I don't know whether we could give a definition. I don't know who would be legitimate to give a definition. And I wonder whether it's a moral notion or a heuristic notion. And I don't think any answer has been provided along this line. So for me, responsible development is a value-loaded proposition. The connection made in this session, tackling inequality through responsible development, implicitly at least suggests that there is a vision of social justice there that considers that tackling inequalities matter, and in which, therefore, responsibility has a strong social and collective dimension. Well, these are political philosophy premises, and they are not, that is not yet, shared globally. And any view about the end of history, for example, proposed by Hegel and then more recently by Fukuyama, is still more an hypothesis than a reality. So in a way, we would like to define in this room what responsible means, but my point is that it's not going to be very relevant if others don't share that. So how do we get to these shared views about responsibility? The second question is, what inequalities are we talking about? And of course, François's conference last night was very useful to sort out the kind of and what Branko told us was very useful to sort out part of the issues. But this could be inequality of income, it could be inequality of access to services, of access to the labor market, of political power. In short, there is this easy separation between inequality of opportunities and inequality of income, and we should decide that inequality of opportunities is a bad thing, and that the inequality of income that may result from an effort-based use of opportunities is totally acceptable. It's a bit more complex than that, because when you seize opportunities with your talent and your efforts, then that may lead to inequality of incomes. But these inequalities of income for the next generations will produce inequalities of opportunities. So we cannot ignore inequalities of incomes either. I've said we. I had promised to myself that I would never say we, and I couldn't avoid that, which shows the tendency that we have to actually tell other people what they should do. Let me propose then a definition of responsible development. For me, it's a process through which all individual actors follow a quote-unquote responsible behavior that is dictated by shared norms and standards and a shared vision of what development should look like. And then this process is sanctioned by monitoring about whether the outputs of such behavior conform to this vision. So it's an ongoing process in which there are some basic values to guide responsibility, then people behave responsibly, and we monitor whether that leads to the desired outcome. This actually requires to look in detail at how these norms and standards are defined, who defined them, and that may be different from country to country, and how then they are implemented through formal and informal mechanisms of the society. Let me just remind you that in developing countries, informal relations and transactions occupy generally more than 80% of the total transactions. So this is something that requires a lot of attention. Let me now move to some positive aspects. What is the situation in developing countries? We have spoken about some macro evolutions, macro trends, the emergence of a middle class, and so on. My suggestion here is that we in this room don't know well enough the situation in developing countries to make recommendations into policy-making processes. More data are needed, and they should be generated locally, as complementary to the efforts that global indicators have been, which has flourished recently, are making. It is true that the data and factual coverage have presumably made considerable progress with respect to the income component of poverty and inequality, and this conference has further documented this, notably with respect to the rise of the middle class in most places in the world, but this is highly insufficient. On the one hand, a number of transactions do not take place on markets. For example, for the poor communities in Africa and elsewhere where you have a lot of auto consumption, or they take place through informal markets in which they are not properly recorded. On the other hand, it is now well understood that access to basic services is a crucial component of poverty and welfare and inequalities, but this plays more through quality than quantity, and measuring quality is yet an unmet challenge in education, in health, in water services, and so on. Poverty itself is not only a static concept. We want to know what happens over time. What is the likelihood that poor people will stay poor? What is the likelihood that people beyond the poverty line may fall back below the poverty line? And therefore that requires analyzing risks that poor populations face in developing countries. And the way in which these risks can be mitigated is a crucial component of inequality, which is not in the factual static statistics. And finally, how are standards created? I was very, very encouraged by the examples given by Peter a little while ago, because this is probably the way to go. Let me end at what we in this group might be willing to do. First of all, the domestic policy agenda can indeed be influenced by foreign advisors. We in this room can have an influence. If we agree on some messages to carry, this might have an influence. But, however, we cannot direct the domestic policy processes. And the real question is what needs to change so that what we in this room believe in can be mainstreamed into the domestic political agendas in the developing countries. And this implies local actors. So unless we understand better how they behave, we cannot really make a difference. Much more is needed to document the interaction between growth and inequalities, not only from growth to inequalities, but also the other way around, from inequalities to growth, as François Bourguignon mentioned yesterday. Document the nature and characteristics of the emerging middle class, and these will have to be contextualized. One way to have an influence is to document and advertise unacceptable situations through credible empirical research. This is a powerful way to influence policies by raising the policymakers' attention. And finally, I think a crucial point is to engage the local academic communities instead of relying on foreign academic studies. I mean, we can have the best, and we do have the best researchers in the world, but their research doesn't have full legitimacy locally unless intermediated by the local academic communities. It is necessary that these local academic communities seize the subject of responsible development. If they don't, there won't be any ownership of the issue, and therefore the domestic political process will not take responsible development into account. So my point here is that if we want to have that influence, and even beyond that, if we want to help developing countries, we need to let them decide and to give them the capacity to do it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre. You focused very much on, at the end of your statement, on the importance of bringing the perspectives of local academic actors, local academic institutions in, and linking this with our kind of research and policy recommendation work, which we have been doing actually during the last 50 years, no? Because we are also past dependent. And our kind of past dependent implied that these kind of concepts, development, responsible development, sustainable development, this has been created in the old middle classes and their academic strands being transported and exported then to developing countries, and you ask for a new type of reciprocity there. So thank you very much, Pierre. Luca, now it's yours. You are going to show us some slides also.
Actually, Doug, I think Peter has convinced me not to use it. So, you know it's there, you can have access to it through the web, but I would prefer to share with you some thoughts, actually some alarming thoughts, coming out of my experience in politics more than in academia. Dear colleagues, I started and studied development economics because I was interested in public policy. I then practiced public policy, and I found out that to practice public policy, you need to be more actively engaged in politics. I got actively engaged in politics, and I find out that you need to understand power relations and who actually sets the agenda, who is behind the scenes. And I want to share some of the thoughts about this process, because I think this is really what we need to collectively confront. The major point of my presentation... The micro is not on. Okay. The major point that I want to share with you is one, that the social contract, which we thought we had, and we still think we have, and which formed the basis of redistributive policies and of responsible development, whatever that means, after the war and over the past decades, has become irrelevant and defunct. It needs to be renegotiated, redrafted, and reinstituted. Why is it defunct? Because the key strategic players who call the shots are not sitting around the table. and I want to talk about this. Before I do that, allow me to say a few points coming out of the inequality research agenda, which would lead me into the political argument. What kind of inequality are we talking about? I think the most important point brought about in Piketty's book is one, that the distribution of capital ownership and of income from capital is always, in all countries and at all times, more concentrated than the distribution of income from labor. That the major source of inequality does not come from labor income, it comes from capital ownership. And to me that was, and you can find all the data, and I have it in the PowerPoint, it's on page 244 of this huge book by Piketty, which you can find, but I think this is the important point. Almost half of the world's wealth is now owned by just 1% of the population. 1% of the population, half of the world's wealth. The wealth of the 1% richest people in the world amounts to 110 trillion. That's 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world's population. Or, put alternatively, the bottom half of the world's population owns the same as the richest 85 people in the world. Now, you can put forward a lot of statistics. One added, last one, that the top 10% of the capital income distribution owns on average more than 50% of all wealth. In some societies as much as 90%, whereas the upper 10% of the labor income distribution generally receives 25 to 30% of total labor income. So if you look around inequality coming out of labor income and out of capital ownership and returns to capital, the source of major inequality is on wealth. This has implications for policy. We used to think, and as economists and policymakers, we used to think that inequality had to do with labor markets, primarily, with skills, with education, with opportunities. That's all true. It might have also to do with globalization, as capital is moving. That's also true. But the important kind of implication of the sources of inequality is that it has to do with saving and investment decisions, with what is happening in capital markets, and that if we want to tackle inequality, we need to look much more carefully at what is happening in the capital markets. Now, what are the implications, before I go on to the political argument, what are the implications for our research? That looking at Gini coefficients doesn't help much. Gini coefficients are aggregate indices which mix together inequality due to labor income disparities and capital income disparities. They do not address the inequality of ownership. They do not address power relations which are behind these statistics. The second, I think, important implication for our research is that the policy agenda coming from these two sources of inequalities is completely different. If you think that inequality of labor income is the major source of inequality, then you look at policies having to do with education, with skills, with labor markets, etc., etc. If you think, and I'm convinced that inequality comes because of differences in the distribution of assets and capital, then you really need to look at strategic actors and policies that have to do with tax and inheritance, the operation of real estate markets, the operation of financial markets. Now, if we look at the latter, what do we see? That, in my view, at the global level, we have the outcome of this inequality is the outcome of 3 what I will call global public failures of policymakers that need to be tackled and addressed collectively. We used to think about global public goods. I want to talk about global public failures. 3 of them, at least, which I think are of paramount importance. The first one is a failure to supervise and regulate a highly concentrated and powerful global financial system, which is increasingly engaged in speculative investment activities rather than intermediation. In 1999, after the Asian financial crisis, I was a member of the Policy Development Committee of the Development Policy Committee of the United Nations. We issued then a report in 1999 about the need to bring about what we call then a World Financial Organization, a WFO, which would bring together under one organization, would create an organization to set rules of conduct and bring together all these segmented committees which were looking at different parts of financial market regulation. Needless to say that this was completely put aside, and the argument came back 2 years ago, but actually nobody talks about it anymore. We're not supervising, we're not regulating the financial system. There was an amazing study done in 2012 by a Swiss firm. It's entitled The Network of Global Corporate Control. It was published in October 2012 by the Swiss Federal Institute, and it analyzed a database of 37 million corporations and investors worldwide. It's an amazing study. It demonstrates that the world's largest corporations are closely interconnected, and that a small consortium of 147 corporations, 147, form a super entity which has control over 40% of the world's wealth. These mega corporations are mostly banks. They include Barclays, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and Vanguard Group, UBS, Deutsche Bank, Bank of New York Mellon, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America Corporation, and Société Générale. Now, the importance of this super entity is that it basically has shifted political power and decision-making. And if you analyze many of the decisions taken by governments, you find behind them decisions by financial institutions. To me, the most worrisome is that the social partners as we knew them are being increasingly captured. Yesterday we were talking, and I was listening to François Bourguignon talking about political leadership. If you search political leadership throughout our world, in developed and developing countries alike, are more often than not influenced, if not captured, by financial interests. Our political parties are increasingly depending on financial capital and on advertising. Individual politicians see their campaigns financed by major corporations and banks. So the state, the political system, its own independence is slowly being eroded. Firms, increasingly even large firms and small-scale firms even more, are increasingly dependent on credit to survive, to renegotiate loans, to start operations, or to close down. It's up to banks and in their discretion to refinance or restructure loans, since they are not obliged to disclose terms of the preconditions for their decisions. It's interesting to note that only 4 out of the continents of Europe's 10 biggest banks, ranked by assets, disclose any information on loans they renegotiate. They thus end up determining to a large extent the distribution of capital ownership, the rates of return to capital, the solvency of companies, and their capacity to survive or go bankrupt. In doing so, they do not have to abide by any rules of transparency or accountability. The solvency of nations is also dependent on financial institutions. Allow me to say something personal. The Greek debt restructuring for 2 years was not discussed publicly because European banks and German banks were up to their ears with Greek bonds. So they first had to give away 130 billion, to divest 130 billion worth of bonds before political leadership in Europe opened the discussion of a debt renegotiation. So don't tell me that if in a developing country, which is going through a macro adjustment program or a standby agreement with a debt overhang, and it needs to renegotiate its debt, if the large banks, which are behind the scenes, if they hold these bonds, they're going to allow it to proceed. They're not going to allow it to proceed. So the first, I think, failure is the failure, I'm finishing, is the failure to supervise and regulate a highly concentrated and powerful global financial system. The second one is the failure to regulate tax havens. And I think that's clear, but the two failures are interrelated. Bank secrecy allows tax evasion and tax avoidance. So the two are interrelated, and the fact that we have not proceeded on having any rules of conduct for tax havens is partly the result of an increased power of financial capital. And the third failure is a failure to introduce a social protection floor, whatever that means, and we can go, there's a huge debate as to what that should be, that the ILO has proposed as a standard to any economic policy, as an integral component of a macro adjustment program. So 3 global public failures. If we want, therefore, to proceed with responsible development, we need to tackle these 3 challenges. And I'm finishing with 3 proposals. On transparency, regulation, and supervision of financial system. The most timid step we could do is to adopt Zuckman's proposal to have a global financial registry, which would track wealth holdings as a first step. And then there can be all sorts of proposals that we can elaborate all the way up to creating a WFO, a World Financial Organization. Tax havens. If we want responsible development, and if we want to have the capacity as national governments to tax people, tax havens need to be abolished. And a third, we should push so that a social protection floor can become an integral part of sustainable policies and an integral part and a comprehensive goal in the post-2015 agenda. So the social contract needs to be renegotiated, redrafted, and reinstituted. And politically, we should bring financial capital around the table. And if we're talking about a G20, I think this is the G20's responsibility to have a table of stakeholders who really call the shots. Otherwise, we, as Peter said, will be not participants, but just onlookers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Luca, for your perspective on the importance of financial markets and power structures, no? And giving us several suggestions regarding important elements of what you called a social contract for at the end of the day, sustainable global economy, what you have been reflecting on. I would like to ask two questions towards our colleagues here on the panel, and then we move into the auditorium. My first question is going to Branko. Branko, when you link your story of the two dynamics regarding inequality in nations, and then from a global perspective between global citizens, when you link these two stories on inequality with what Luca has been saying, the driver of economic dynamics based on financial market trends, and related or resulting power structures built on these kind of dynamics in financial markets. How are you bringing these two stories together? And bringing those together, how would you evaluate the chance for moving more into an inclusive global economy? Or is this, if you bring your stories together, is this driving into even more fragmented global economy?
Let me just first see. Yeah, it is working. I will be very brief, actually, on the latter about power structures. Obviously, when you work with the data on household surveys and incomes, you don't include power structures. So this is purely, incomes. I think one of the great, Luca mentioned that one of the great virtues of Piketty's book was that it brought back, as of course everybody knows by now, brought back the importance of capital and of capital incomes. We have known for a long time, so it was not a novelty, that the concentration of capital incomes has been greater than the concentration of labor incomes. What was actually new, of course there are many other things which are new in the book, but what was also new is that it was known, but it was not really that much discussed, is that the share of capital income in total income has been on the rise in the last 20 years. So that has also been known, but it was not really put in a unified framework. So now when you have these two things together, then of course it really puts an entirely different spin on the whole thing. Of course, I have to say that actually, obviously, the book is dealing, and of course, Luca was dealing also with rich countries. Actually, if you look at the data that Piketty has, these are data essentially from the rich countries, and the more that we move into developing countries, these data are really not particularly reliable or useful. And I'll just finish with one issue. One issue that I think would be on the proposals, I would very much agree on the first two, definitely. But I think that one should not forget that there could be a potential conflict of interest between the rich countries and the emerging economies. In other words, certain parts of the social contract, ILO, floor, this or that, may not be really acceptable for the countries that actually they might see that as a way of being outcompeted by the rich world. So, there is not a coincidence of interest between the two always.
Yeah, thank you very much, Branko. The other question which I came up to my mind, or other observation, is that the four of you, I mean Luca and Peter and Joita and Pierre, you have all been talking about different types of social contracts at the end of the day. You talked about philosophical fundamentals of development, Pierre. You all mentioned the social contract issue, focusing on very different aspects, actually. Your major point, Luca, was financial markets, power relations, and we have to redefine the social contract regarding social fundamentals and power fundamentals. Peter and Joita, you have been focusing much more than on the sustainability and social standards dimension. So at the end of the day, you all talked about a new social contract on different levels. You have been talking much about bottom-up processes, most of the other ones talking about global approaches. My question to you is twofold. The first part of the question is, do the global new middle classes help us to redefine this new kind of global social contract you all have been reflecting on? This is the first part of the question. The second part of the question is, are we on track, if we link this kind of social contract you talk about, are we on track with the 2015 debate? I mean, we do have a global discussion about something like a new global contract on development. No? Do we have the right elements in place already from your perspective? And I would like to ask you to give a very brief answer, and then we move towards the auditorium. Peter, you first, and then we rush through the plenary, the plenary speakers.
Okay. Last week I finished a paper with a colleague of mine on the different social contracts in China, India and Brazil, and the ways in which that influences the likelihood of responsibility initiatives actually taking hold. So rushing through the answer is maybe more difficult for me now that I've just finished such a paper. But
60 seconds.
Okay, I think a direct answer to your question is that because middle classes are such a heterogeneous phenomena, especially in these sort of large emerging economies, they at the moment do not play a role in shaping a new social contract. Social contracts are still held and negotiated by much more traditional parties with vested interests, as Luca has also emphasized, that, and Pierre's story about that many of the relevant actors are not at the table with today's social contract negotiations in a literal sense. Second, and then I'll stop. There are wild assumptions both ways in the scanty literature on what do middle-class consumers in emerging economies really care about. Yeah, some people say they don't care about the environment, they don't care about poverty, they don't care about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because they are too poor themselves, or they've just come out of poverty, etc., etc. Others say are much more romantic about this, and they say, well, no, people from these countries care much more about these things because, after all, they come from the global south. These are more sort of Western academics who write these kinds of assertions, I think. The sad truth is that we basically have very little knowledge about the consumer preferences and the extent to which ethical considerations play a role among consumers in the global south more generally, not just middle class or subgroups of middle class. All the research about ethical inclinations of consumers is about American and European consumer groups, except for 1 or 2 exceptions which we cannot generalize upon. So this is very much an open agenda. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Peter. Joita?
So I'll take your second question first. Right now we are having the Sustainable Development Goal discussion at the United Nations. It's focusing on, it had 19 Sustainable Development Goals, now it's moved to 17, and I think eventually it'll come down to less than 10. And what you find is that there they are talking about social, the flaws, social flaws, human rights, those issues will be taken into account, and they're all trying to take into account the planetary boundaries issues, but perhaps climate change will not be on top of the list. You probably may find more emphasis given to access to drinking water and sanitation and those kinds of issues. So in many ways, a social contract is being discussed right now, and it's possible that the states will be unable to come to some kind of agreement, but you're seeing social movements, maybe not from the middle classes. So the social movements are across the classes, sometimes they're from the lower classes, sometimes from the NGO world. They are trying to influence this entire process as well as the academic world. So that's the answer to the second question. In relation to the first question about the middle classes, and here I would like to also come back to something Pierre mentioned. He said we should not perhaps advise other countries how their middle classes should function, but I would start with advising our own middle classes in the north, and they should go on a CO2 diet. I mean, our middle classes are not being responsible enough in terms of reducing our own environmental footprint and making space for the South to increase their emissions, and so making space for the South to grow. So I think we can, even if we don't want to advise how the Chinese middle class should behave, there's a lot of responsibility on us as scholars to try and figure out, on the basis of our own analysis in the North, what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgita. Pierre? The microphone, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I agree very much with what Joita just said. And before I start, I also, because what I'm going to be next is probably different, I also agree very much with the recommendation that you made, Luca, for the global social contract. Let me start with your first question. Do global middle classes help redefine global social contract? Let me first note that we like to put global in front of everything we discuss. So we have the global south, we have the global whatever, and I'm a global citizen. And I am a global citizen. What I mean to say is that I don't know what a global middle class is. When I look at middle classes in India or in China, I live in India, so I have some practical experience, if not academic experience of the issue. In China, I don't know, but I would suspect that most of what drives these middle classes is not the global situation. And if I can say something about big emerging countries, is that they still don't have any concrete feel of their global responsibility. They are not as much interested in the global world as we are in the rich countries. So it seems to me the question is a bit theoretical, and that this is not the way it's going to play. The second question, are we on track with the 2015 debate? Yeah, I agree that the 2015 discussion is a discussion about a global social contract. However, I think there are several things in a quote-unquote global social contract. One is the setting of goals, and one is a discussion of principles and processes and values. And on goals, what worries me a little bit is that I think the degree of ownership is still limited. For one reason, is that the negotiators who discuss these broad goals may agree between themselves, but it doesn't mean that in their society there is ownership of the goals. And for the previous ones, the Millennium Development Goals, there was an agreement at the UN, so you could argue that it was actually indeed a global set of goals. But when you discussed with the local governments, the degree of ownership was very limited. And I knew, at least in the first part of the period, I knew of very few local development strategies that would be based on the MDGs. So I think that's one aspect. The second aspect is that there is a danger with goals. Is that, as we discussed already, the reality of development is complex and multidimensional. When you pick up a few goals, you forget a number of other relevant issues. So if the setting of goals leads us to neglect other actions that could be as important, then, and because everything is interrelated, then we made a mistake. So, I mean, I'm still not sure where we go on that setting of goals. And on processes, they are just not there. So we are content with setting goals. But how credible are goals without the processes that underlie the goals? I don't know. So I think this process is still full of shortcomings. And again, from my point of view, we need we pay lip service to principles like ownership. Everyone agrees that ownership is important. But when it comes to action, we would like people to own what we recommend them.
Okay. Thanks for this self-critical perspective, Pierre.
Very short. On Branko, I don't think the agenda is different for developed and developing countries. I think the degree might differ, and the issue of the coalition of interests would not be at the national level, but I think in terms of strategic actors. You could see a lot of coalition of interests between taxpayers in the south, or wage earners or pensioners in the south and the north, as opposed to vested interests which are internationalized and set the agenda. Secondly, on the social contract, I think the debate on social standards that Peter and mentioned is the same issue and has a lot to do with power fundamentals. Who sets the agenda? Who sets social standards? What we see is that the social contract has moved from a national setting to a global setting, and there we really need to analyze the stakeholders and who holds the power in that global setting to influencing. And last, in the post-2015 agenda, my sense is that it will become more irrelevant if we do not address the global governance issues, some of which we have already addressed.
Okay, thank you very much. So now it's time for questions, and I see one hand already here. The lady in the middle. Yes, it's you first. Mm. Yes.
Okay, I'm Meera Tiwari from University of East London. Thank you very much to the panel for such insightful views. The mic is not working, so I'm trying to... Okay, it is now. Right, okay.
Now it is, so
right,
use
okay.
it.
Yes. Thank you very much for a very insightful morning, really thought-provoking views. My question is to Joita and to Luca. So yes, I completely support your CO2 diet prescription to the northern countries. So I'm your first supporter. And secondly, could I just ask you as a starting point of this campaign that we propose a taxation on countries that use air conditioning when the temperatures outside couldn't be more than 23 degrees centigrade. Second, my question is to Luca for highlighting the second source of inequality being the labor income. I know Thomas Piketty, as you also said, has talked about the capital income formation and growth as the main, and Branko Milanovic very highlighted that. Well, we knew about it, but it's in the way that it's been articulated. And you also then mentioned labor income. Now, if we look up if you bring in social mobility debate, that's what we are all trying to achieve, because you have people, the very poor people, and again, Branko's chart. So you have very poor. Will some of that proportion move into the masses, and the masses then build up the skill income, where they do go to capital formation. So where is the future then? Eventually there will be a bigger middle class, not now, but that's what we are going, because there's labor income inequality, and there's capital, but the labor income would eventually, the investments are coming through the labor skills, what we benefit through labor income.
So thank you very much for your questions. I saw two hands here in the first rows. Please, the mic. And we'll pick up 5 or 6 and then give them back to the panel for a last round of comments. Yeah.
Thank you. Sheila Page, Overseas Development Institute. I want to suggest that we are dealing with two different definitions of responsible. Responsible in terms of outcome, something we, and I bow to Professor Jacquet, we in this room would like, but also responsible in the sense of chosen by the majority, which is the sort of the political definition of responsible. And I would really want very much to support that this sort of organization should be interested in development chosen by the people who are being developed, which includes us in developed countries, but also those in developing countries. In other words, it's a question of process. It's not a question of outcomes. And I think that for this reason, it's not really useful to have recommendations in the passive voice. It should always be how we are going to achieve things and what we are going to do. Because I think the problem is, and here I'm afraid I differ from Professor Jacquet, we don't have shared norms. We do not have shared norms. And without shared norms, we have to have some form of, I would argue, democratic way of choosing among the norms, not of imposing what I would like in the way of financial, but in terms of putting things very much on the emphasis of how we reach decisions about development and leave it to other people what those decisions are.
Okay, thank you very much. It's you now.
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. Jean-Luc Morer, Graduate Institute, Geneva. Thank you very much for this very insightful panel, all of you. The ideas about the link between inequality and responsible development and the global middle classes is really very insightful. I'm not an economist like most of you, and I would like to add another concern about the things that you said. Those, to me, the global middle class, both those from rich countries that are getting poorer and those from poor countries that are getting richer, as was brightly shown by Branko, want to, defend their interests, basically. The interests they are losing in the north and the new interest that they are gaining in the South. Yeah? And for this, I'm afraid they tend to turn to populist solutions which are offered by political actors that don't give a damn about responsible development and that are totally opposed to the global governance ideas that were put forward by Joyita or to the new definition of a global social contract that you were proposing also, Luca. I'm afraid this is leading to a revive nasty forms of nationalism which will lead us further away from the solutions that you are proposing. I would like to have your reactions on that.
Okay, thank you very much. It's yours now, and then yours.
Is it on? Okay. Yes, I have two questions related to the definition of the so-called global middle class or global middle classes, either plural or singular. Personally, I think this is a very important issue we need to try to settle because if we are not clear or if we don't have some kind of common understanding of this definition, then our arguments related to middle class or middle classes can be kind of problematic. So from this panel this morning, I found two interesting arguments or two interesting approaches. First, Professor Milanovic, if I pronounce your name correctly, used the quantitative indicator to identify this so-called middle class or middle classes. The range of the income, which is pretty broad, like from $10 to $100 per day. I'm kind of interested in your rationale behind the use of this economic indicator to identify middle class. I can give you my perception of middle class or middle classes in China using your definition, quantitative definition, $10 per day for a person in the Chinese major cities. It's not really considered middle class. It's kind of a poverty line, even in China. Okay, so and also I can tell you, based on my personal experience and the experience of my study, these people with $10 per day actually are considered a lower class, socially, economically. And also, I would like to make ask another question about the. Probably definition or maybe a kind of tentative approach used by Professor Noringa. Is that right? Okay. So when you use this definition or use the term global middle class, you also use another term which seems to be kind of interchangeable with middle class or global middle class. The term is second generation of middle class. As I understand, by second generation of middle class, you mean the second generation of middle classes in the developed countries. Do you really mean to generalize the characteristics of the second generation of middle class in the developed countries to the global level? If you do, I find it a little bit problematic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question goes to the lady here on the left.
Thank you. I'm Gabrielle Kohler, UNRISD, and also a member of Women in Europe for a Common Future. Thank you to the panel for making a relation to the SDG and MDG discussions. And I'd like to make a comment and a question to Professor Katselli. Comment, I think there's a fourth public failure, which is around regulating global value chains and the employment conditions in them. And the question is, I very much appreciate your pitch for the social floor, the global social floor movement. But seeing, as you very strikingly outlined, the role of financial capital, how would one get finance capital to actually agree to that? Because it wouldn't be in their interest. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your question and the comment. We have the chance to react to several of these questions and comments. Please try to be brief and selective. 1 minute for each of you. And I would like to start this time with Pierre, and then we move around the non-existing table here.
Thank you. Two very brief comments. We seem to have moved a little bit toward the end of the discussion to what we should do. And Luca guided us on a number of recommendations. So my comment, which is a question, is how about talking a little bit about the how? I mean, for example, a global social floor. I personally, as a citizen, agree with that. How do we proceed given that it has not happened yet? Same for the tax havens, same for many ideas that were discussed. So again, it's easy to agree together on the what should be. It's easy. It's already difficult, but we find ways to agree on what should be done. But the real question is why hasn't it been done yet, and what can we do to make this more feasible? My second comment is on process and outcomes. I fully agree with you that process are very, very important. However, we cannot ignore the outcomes, and there is an interaction between process and outcomes. So, in my view, we should less. Sorry about that. I mean, the processes matter, but there should be a monitoring mechanism there to make sure that the process leads to outcomes that are shared by the greatest number. So it's a bit complex, but I mean, sort of interactive design there, rather than setting outcomes and stopping there.
Coming to the CO2 diet, I think we can forgive the people for this room being air-conditioned because a lot of the energy in Germany comes from renewable energy. But having said that, what you do find is that we do need norms for consumers. But sometimes it's really easy because if you tell producers to simply put an on-off button instead of a standby button, you can save 15% of your energy use. So there are a lot of simple things that can be done which don't really need a change in normative behavior. But to come back to your question, we don't have shared norms, so how can we proceed? But in law, for example, we do have a norm that's both applied at domestic context and international, which is called the no harm principle. So we can go to court and try and deal with these issues in terms of externalized impacts on other people. But even with human rights, I mean, we're not going fast enough, but we can use the courts for those purposes. And I would try and do that as a way to even get the courts industry to pay their taxes, because I think if we all were to decide as social movements or people, we can all go to the courts. We don't have to wait for our politicians. So that's how I would try and deal it.
Okay, also two short points. One, I think, is on the normative positive distinction that seems to, it's difficult for us to be clear about when we're talking about what. And I think this is typically a topic where we often tend to slip into the normative, where we talk about the aspirations of what we would hope that these groups of people would want to stand for, because that would lead to a better world. While the kind of people that are doing research on the ground like myself, we find very sobering, practical, down-to-earth issues that occupy the agendas of these groups of people predominantly. And the gap between these aspiration levels and what we actually see on the ground is something that we need to tackle. And to do that, that's the second point, it's important to have clear definitions. I very much agree with that point. And no, I was not trying to generalize. I was simply trying to illustrate the point that next to the quantitative dimensions of can somebody be considered middle class, and that is shifting also over time. And it's shifting also depending on whom you ask, because a $2 a day person may consider somebody who earns $15 a day as middle class as compared to him or herself, while we would maybe not consider that person middle class. So that is shifting. What I simply wanted to illustrate is that the attitudinal dimension of the aspirational middle class thinking is different, and it's linked not necessarily to particular levels of income, but, and I thought that the plenary yesterday had made some interesting comments on that, it might be more related to the extent to which you are used to being not in that more vulnerable group of middle class, but that you have grown up in that kind of a security, more stable, and that would be something that, for example, in urban China, maybe in the next generation, would become a very major feature that we would have to investigate. But for me, these are empirical questions, and I would like to stay on the positive side here and sort of challenge those who are too clearly only normative to make sure that they keep track of the sobering information that comes from the research that is actually taking place.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
The first question that was asked about from social mobility to higher skill income to capital formation, it's kind of, I think, a romantic view of trickling upwards. We were thinking of trickling down, now it's trickling upwards. I'm afraid that we don't have evidence that even if labor income goes up, this changes the wealth accumulation. It's more an outcome of inheritance, of elite formation, etc., etc. So I have not seen the evidence as yet that you can trickle upward and that the capital ownership disparities could be mitigated by thinking of greater income, labor income equality, even though it's important. Secondly, I agree with Jean-Luc on the issue of nationalism, but I would say that this is an outcome of a lack of political representation. I think increasingly there is a tremendous problem in our political systems, which we see in the developed countries, but we see increasingly in middle-income countries, in upper middle-income countries, where outcomes are dictated not by due processes or democratic processes, but by elites and political settlements at the top. So that creates a disenchantment, and because we have elections every 4 years, that kind of creates incentives for nationalism. So I think unless we tackle the major issue, which is who decides and under what, as Sheila very correctly pointed out, what is the process by which we decide, then I think we will see increased nationalism, and this is the outcome of that malaise as opposed to the source of that malaise. Thirdly, kind of regulating value chains. Well, if you look at this super entity that I talked about, if this study actually is valid, which I think it is, then this kind of oligopolistic structure of decision making at the global level, whether it is from mega corporations and value chains or from the financial system mostly, because even value chains depend on the financial system, needs to be explored and see what type of regulation you need. And I come to the last point that I think Pierre mentioned. How do you proceed? I mean, the question is, how do we organize for change? And the answer I will give is the same that I would give in domestic politics. Ideas matter. Networks and pressure groups matter. Political action matters. So ideas, I think the first thing, and that's something where we as researchers have an added responsibility of clarifying our thoughts and giving one or two messages which are clear. And we should talk more between ourselves to weigh evidence here and there and get with some clear messages that could have an impact. Secondly, even if you have the best idea, if you don't have a pressure group, you cannot do anything with it. So you need to organize a pressure group. And I think we, as academics, researchers, interested citizens, have a responsibility. And if we're talking about responsible development, we have a responsibility to create a pressure group in all the four, especially those of us who are involved in policy advice and policy research. And three, for some crazy ones who want to get into actual politics, we could go to even the extra step and try to defend these. And that needs, from my experience, people, first of all, who have worked in their lives and who don't depend on politics for a living. And secondly, people who are not easily corrupted.
Okay. Just a few last points from my side. I would like first to address the question that Jean-Luc mentioned. That's the question of populism, what I called actually populism or plutocracy, or populism and plutocracy, because I think they often go together. Go back to that slide, if you remember, which I call the supine S, which shows stagnation of incomes among the lower half of the distribution in rich countries. Assume for the moment that it's true that actually there is some relationship between the growth in the emerging markets and stagnation of the incomes in the rich world. And then assume that after China, which is now getting richer, you have the next wave, which could be the wave of Indonesia and the wave after that of India and Nigeria and further waves like that. Then the question that you ask yourself, is democracy in the rich world feasible with 50 years or 60 years or 70 years of stagnation of incomes of the lower half of the population? And then if you ask that question, you obviously have an answer that is going to be very difficult. And that's where these two issues, that's why I think actually, either globalization would continue with plutocracy ruling the rich world, or globalization would be derailed with populism taking hold in the rich world. And I think this is the essential dilemma, because if you look at that graph from a global point of view is actually quite a good graph. You actually have large increases in real income of the people who are in the median and below. You just have one group of people who are actually not growing. The problem is political, because political decisions in Germany or Greece or elsewhere are not political decisions whether the Chinese are becoming richer. Political decisions is like lower middle class or middle class in these countries doing well. So we have here the disconnect between the political situation or political systems which are nation-based and the economic system which has become really fairly globalized. And that's why I come to the redistribution within rich countries as a need to placate the losers of globalization, or otherwise globalization will be derailed. So I come from a very different perspective, and I'm a little bit less sanguine than Luca that actually these differences in income do not matter. I think they do really matter. I mean, you see it in Europe. I've actually had a friend, and people have heard actually when it comes to Greece arguments that, like Estonia, a guy from Estonia says, why should we really help Greece when our mean wage is lower than Greek minimum wage? These issues matter. We cannot just say, they don't exist. And of course, the gaps between the rich world and the poor world are even much greater. So that makes it very difficult, I think, a joint policy in some areas. On the middle class in China, I will not go into now $10 a day. This is actually a rather arbitrary number, and that's why I'm not a big fan of deciding on the global middle class. It has some background in Latin American work, but you can see in the Chinese numbers that I've shown you, actually you have, of course, the dominant group in the urban areas are people between $10 and $100, but there is still a large group of people who are below 10. So maybe in Shanghai $10 is not considered like much money, but actually the household surveys data do tell you that even in the urban areas you have something like 1/3 of the population below that. You shake your hand, but that's what the surveys tell you. It's not really, we are not particularly sort of able to representatively ascertain who has what, because we actually basically move in a circle of relatively rich people. So I think that, surveys actually are better in that.
So thank you, Branko. We are coming to the end. I would like to thank the auditorium for listening, for participating, for asking challenging questions and formulating comments also. And of course, the panelists here, I would like to thank all of you. I think you have been producing a lot and a big amount of food for thought for the next round of debates afterwards. So thank you very much for that.